The video, which spread across social media within minutes, showed an engineering marvel disintegrating into dust. The Karaj B1 bridge, considered the tallest in the Middle East and inaugurated earlier in 2026, collapsed into partial ruin on April 2nd during one of the deadliest attacks on civilian infrastructure in the ongoing United States-Iran conflict. But what made this particular strike dramatically different from the thousands of military operations conducted over preceding weeks was not merely its destructive capacity or the scale of casualties that followed. Rather, it exemplified a fundamental shift in the strategic calculus of modern warfare, the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure as a mechanism of political coercion, economic devastation, and what many international law experts are now describing as potential war crimes. 8 civilians lay dead after the initial strike, many of them families celebrating Sizdah Beydar, the Persian New Year festival marking the last day of Nowruz celebrations. Within moments, as first responders rushed to assist the wounded and desperate rescue efforts unfolded beneath the damaged structure, a second missile impacted the area. This double-tap strike, a tactic deliberately designed to maximize civilian casualties by targeting rescue workers, added another 95 wounded to the toll. Yet this single attack represents merely one chapter in an escalating campaign that has fundamentally transformed how military planners approach conflict in the 21st century, replacing traditional military targets with civilian systems that billions of people depend upon daily. The 2026 Iran War, initiated by United States and Israeli forces on February 28th, began with extraordinary lethality that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of West Asia. That first day saw the assassination of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei through precision military strikes, along with dozens of other senior Iranian military and political officials. What followed was not the anticipated swift conclusion to a regional confrontation, but rather the opening of a prolonged conflict that expanded systematically from military installations to infrastructure systems serving civilian populations. The initial retaliation from Tehran demonstrated the regime's extensive arsenal of ballistic missiles and drone systems, with hundreds of projectiles launched toward Israel, American military installations throughout the Gulf region, and allied states including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. However, Iran's most significant and consequential response came not through conventional military strikes, but through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway through which approximately 1/5 of all global oil and natural gas traded before the conflict passed through daily. This choke point, through which roughly 21% of global petroleum trade transited in peacetime, represented Iran's most powerful asymmetric leverage. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued explicit warnings, forbidding all vessel passage, deployed naval assets to enforce the blockade, and laid sophisticated sea mines throughout the strategic waterway, effectively holding global energy supplies hostage to their political and military objectives. Understanding the historical context illuminates why this particular moment in April 2026 represented such a dangerous escalation point in an already catastrophic conflict. The relationship between the United States and Iran had been defined by tension, hostility, and periodic crises since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, a seismic geopolitical event that fundamentally restructured Middle Eastern power dynamics and created nearly 5 decades of adversarial relations. Throughout the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, both Tehran and Baghdad had regularly threatened to disrupt shipping through the Persian Gulf, leading to what historians called Operation Earnest Will, wherein American naval forces escorted and protected oil tankers from Iranian naval attacks in a dangerous game of maritime brinkmanship. These standoffs occurred with cyclical regularity throughout the subsequent decades, with Iran frequently threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to international pressure, sanctions, or military actions. Each iteration increased regional tensions, yet none had escalated to the point of actual sustained closure and military strikes on the waterway's critical infrastructure. The historical precedent for attacks on civilian infrastructure existed, certainly, but primarily in fragmented, limited operations rather than the systematic campaign that emerged in spring 2026. What changed fundamentally between previous confrontations and this moment was not merely the scale of military capability deployed, but the explicit policy decision to treat civilian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, water desalination facilities, and even universities and hospitals as legitimate targets deserving of destruction. The B-1 bridge attack occurred within this broader context of dramatically escalating military operations. According to Dr. Michael Richardson, a structural engineering expert and infrastructure security analyst at the Institute for Regional Stability, the targeting of the B-1 bridge represents a strategic decision to degrade Iran's development capacity, rather than to achieve any traditional military objective. This bridge was unfinished construction when struck, which underscores that infrastructure itself, not military hardware housed within it, has become the explicit target. American officials, including President Donald Trump himself, justified the strike by claiming the bridge constituted a planned military supply route for sustaining Iran's ballistic missile and attack drone force, characterizing it as a legitimate military target despite its clearly civilian utility as a transportation thoroughfare. The discrepancy between the stated military justification and the actual circumstances of the strike became central to the controversy surrounding American operations. Wes Bryant, a former United States Air Force Special Operations targeting expert who served as Chief of Civilian Harm Assessments at the Pentagon, independently verified the use of precision-guided 2,000-pound bombs in the attack, noting that civilians had been visibly present in the immediate vicinity at the time of impact. Investigative analysis revealed footage showing families picnicking on hillsides overlooking the bridge, with visible baskets and tents when the initial strike occurred. The double-tap strike methodology employed in the Karaj attack followed a pattern that had become increasingly common throughout the 2026 campaign. Yet the tactic itself carries profound legal and ethical implications that demand careful examination. Dr. Sarah Chen, an international humanitarian law specialist at Columbia University Law School, explained the mechanism and its consequences in stark terms. Double-tap strikes exploit the humanitarian impulse of rescue and recovery. When the first strike occurs, civilians and rescue workers rush to the scene to extract survivors and provide emergency medical care. The second strike, arriving within minutes to hours, deliberately targets this concentration of helpers and victims, maximizing the overall human toll of a single military operation. This represents a deliberate strategy to convert an act of infrastructure destruction into a mass casualty event among civilian responders. The Geneva Conventions, which have governed international humanitarian law for over 7 decades, explicitly prohibit attacks designed to maximize civilian casualties, and the intentional targeting of rescue workers is specifically identified as a war crime. Yet the double-tap tactic, while not entirely new, had achieved new prominence and frequency in the Iran campaign, with defenders of its use arguing that the two strikes were separated in time and targeting intention. This legal distinction has become the subject of intense academic and professional debate, with legal scholars from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Columbia signing an open letter expressing serious concerns about violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including potential war crimes. The immediate tactical devastation from the bridge strike proved less significant than the symbolic message it communicated throughout Iran and the broader Middle Eastern region. The B-1 bridge represented something more than mere infrastructure to Iranian citizens and engineers. It embodied national achievement and development progress in an era when Iran faced international isolation and economic sanctions. The structure had only recently been completed and inaugurated as part of larger modernization efforts connecting Tehran with surrounding provinces and reducing transportation bottlenecks in one of the region's most densely populated areas. When it partially collapsed, sending enormous steel girders and concrete slabs into the ravine below, Iranians experienced it as an attack not merely on transportation infrastructure, but on their nation's development trajectory itself. Satellite imagery and investigative journalism revealed that multiple other critical infrastructure sites had been similarly targeted throughout the campaign, including parts of Iran's electrical generation capacity, oil export terminals, and water treatment facilities. The pattern suggested a coherent strategy that military analysts began describing as de-development, a deliberate campaign to reverse Iran's economic and technological progress by systematically destroying the infrastructure upon which modern civilization depends. The casualty figures from the bridge strike, while tragic, cannot be understood in isolation from the broader violence that had engulfed the region since late February. At least 210 individuals had been killed in military operations throughout the Iran conflict by the time the bridge was struck, with far larger numbers wounded and millions displaced from their homes as military operations intensified. The International Maritime Organization reported that attacks on vessels in the Strait of Hormuz had resulted in additional deaths among seafarers, with innocent maritime workers becoming collateral victims of the strategic contest between Tehran and Washington over control of the waterway. Power outages cascaded through Iranian cities as electrical infrastructure sustained damage, disrupting water treatment, hospital operations, refrigeration of medical supplies, and basic services that billions depend upon daily. Dr. Hassan Mohammadi, an Iranian public health epidemiologist in exile, warned of cascading public health crises. When you destroy electrical infrastructure and water systems during an armed conflict, you don't just kill the people in the immediate blast radius, you create conditions for epidemics, contaminated water supplies, and the collapse of medical systems. These indirect deaths often exceed direct combat casualties by factors of 3 or 4 to 1. This reality, well documented in numerous conflict situations throughout modern history, appeared to receive insufficient attention in strategic planning discussions occurring in Washington. The political rhetoric accompanying the military campaign demonstrated an unprecedented level of explicit threat regarding civilian infrastructure destruction. President Trump, speaking during a primetime address on April 1st, declared, "Next week it gets really bad for them. "We're going to knock out all their power plants," and later described plans to bring Iran back to the Stone Ages, where they belong. These statements, celebrated by supporters as expressions of decisive leadership, generated profound alarm among international legal experts and humanitarian organizations. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth amplified the message, describing existing rules of military engagement as stupid and demanding that military operations prioritize lethality over legality, language that appeared to explicitly encourage violations of established international humanitarian law. The characterization of civilian infrastructure destruction as acceptable military practice represented a departure from decades of international norms that attempted to limit civilian suffering even in contexts of armed conflict. Ambassador James Holbrooke, who served as State Department legal advisor under previous administrations, expressed grave concern. When senior government officials explicitly threatened to target civilian infrastructure systems and dismiss legal constraints as obstacles to overcome, they signaled to military commanders that certain violations have received political authorization. This fundamentally undermines the entire structure of international humanitarian law. The implications of the bridge strike and broader infrastructure campaign extended far beyond the immediate destruction and casualties in Iran itself. The systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure, if permitted to continue and expand, establishes a dangerous precedent for future conflicts worldwide. When nuclear-armed powers like the United States demonstrate willingness to target civilian infrastructure systems, electricity grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, as instruments of political coercion, they legitimize similar tactics for other nations and non-state actors. Russia's systematic destruction of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, for instance, followed similar logic. The deliberate targeting of systems essential to civilian life in order to break public will and force political concessions. China observed these precedents carefully as it contemplated potential military options regarding Taiwan. Middle Eastern nations, witnessing American actions against Iran, recalibrated their own strategic assumptions about what civilian infrastructure systems represented acceptable targets. The normalization of infrastructure targeting as a warfare tactic threatens to fundamentally restructure how conflicts are fought in the 21st century, with civilian populations bearing exponentially greater suffering even in conflicts between military forces. The economic ramifications of the bridge strikes and broader infrastructure destruction extended throughout the global economy in ways that transcended regional borders. The partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz, maintained by Iranian naval forces and mine-laying operations, disrupted global oil supplies and sent petroleum prices soaring. Energy markets, which had already experienced volatility from previous Middle Eastern crises, responded with dramatic price spikes that rippled through economies worldwide. Airlines reduced flight schedules due to elevated fuel costs, shipping companies rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at substantial additional expense, and petrochemical industries curtailed operations facing elevated input costs. Manufacturing sectors dependent on petroleum-derived inputs experienced supply chain disruptions. Electricity generation facilities that relied on natural gas faced elevated operating costs. The cascading effects demonstrated that even localized infrastructure destruction in strategically important regions generated global economic consequences that affected billions of people who had no role in the underlying political dispute. Economists estimated that the bridge strike and related infrastructure destruction contributed to global economic losses exceeding $50 billion in the weeks following the initial attacks, with longer-term consequences potentially far exceeding this initial estimate. A critical examination of the bridge strike requires understanding the specific double-tap methodology and its devastating consequences for civilian protection. The initial missile strike on April 2nd impacted the B-1 structure with precisely calculated force intended to collapse the bridge and destroy its utility as a transportation link. Military planners, reviewing drone footage and real-time intelligence, observed the successful destruction of their stated target. However, instead of concluding operations once the infrastructure had been sufficiently damaged, a second missile arrived within minutes of the initial impact, targeting the precise location where first responders and rescue workers had begun assembling. Iranian sources, including statements from Alborz province governor Qudratollah Saif, documented that the second strike deliberately targeted the rescue and medical response effort that had mobilized following the initial blast. This pattern is neither accidental nor random. Rather, it reflects a deliberate military tactic designed to maximize the human toll of a single operation. A significant body of military research, conducted both by American defense analysts and independent international observers, demonstrates that double-tap strikes systematically result in civilian casualties, exceeding those from the initial strike alone. When rescue workers and medics rush to provide aid, they concentrate in the immediate impact area, creating a dense target for a follow-on strike. Families searching for missing relatives gather near blast sites. Community leaders organize rescue efforts. All of these natural human responses to catastrophe are transformed, through double-tap tactics into vulnerabilities that military planners exploit to multiply casualties. The legal analysis of double-tap strikes under international humanitarian law reveals fundamental violations of protections that have been internationally recognized for generations. The principle of distinction requires combatants to distinguish between military targets and civilian persons or infrastructure, directing attacks exclusively toward legitimate military objectives. Rescue workers, medical personnel, and family members searching for injured relatives represent quintessential civilian populations entitled to protection under all circumstances. The principle of proportionality requires that any anticipated civilian harm be weighed against concrete military advantage gained, with operations canceled if expected. Civilian casualties would be excessive relative to military benefit. In the case of the B-1 bridge strike, the stated military purpose involved destroying a transportation link between Tehran and Karaj. Once the initial strike accomplished this objective, the military advantage had been achieved. The second strike, targeting rescue workers, generated no additional military benefit while multiplying civilian casualties. Under strict proportionality analysis, the second strike violated fundamental international humanitarian law. Dr. James Piscatori, a legal scholar specializing in international humanitarian law at the University of Chicago, articulated this analysis. The double-tap methodology is not a gray area in international law. It represents a clear violation of foundational principles protecting civilian populations. Military personnel ordered to conduct such operations have legal obligations under international law to refuse unlawful orders, regardless of political pressure from superior officials. The broader strategic context of the bridge strike involved the larger struggle for control of the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's capacity to sustain its military forces and civilian economy in the face of intense American military pressure. American military strategists calculated that by systematically destroying Iran's infrastructure, its bridges, power plants, oil export terminals, desalination facilities, they could generate sufficient civilian pressure and economic disruption to force Iranian capitulation regarding control of the strait. This strategy of infrastructure targeting as a tool of political coercion represents a calculated rejection of previous limitations on civilian targeting that had evolved through decades of international agreements and humanitarian law development. The assumption underlying this strategy appears to be that civilian suffering, when sufficiently intense, forces governments to abandon political objectives and accept adversary demands. Historical evidence provides ambiguous support for this assumption. Strategic bombing campaigns throughout World War II, targeting civilian populations and industrial infrastructure in Germany and Japan, did not produce capitulation until military forces were completely defeated in occupied territory. The bombing of North Vietnam, which destroyed substantial infrastructure while deliberately targeting civilian population centers, did not produce political surrender, but rather sustained Vietnamese resolve throughout a conflict lasting decades. More recent infrastructure targeting campaigns in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have not produced the swift political capitulation that military planners anticipated, but rather generated humanitarian catastrophes and strengthened civilian resolve against external pressure. The question of whether military personnel could legally refuse orders to participate in double-tap strikes or broader civilian infrastructure targeting campaigns became increasingly pressing as the Iran conflict expanded. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly raised precisely this issue, arguing that service members possessed legal rights and obligations to refuse unlawful orders regardless of rank considerations or political pressure from superior officials. This observation generated fierce political blowback from Trump administration officials, who argued that military personnel must obey civilian leadership without qualification. However, the Uniform Code of Military Justice explicitly stipulates that service members possess obligations to refuse orders they understand to be unlawful, protecting them from legal jeopardy for disobeying commands that violate law. The potential conflict between political pressure, demanding infrastructure targeting, and legal obligations, prohibiting such operations, created genuine ethical and professional crises for military personnel, particularly those with direct involvement in planning or executing operations they believed violated international law. Several career military officers reportedly submitted formal legal opinions questioning the lawfulness of specific infrastructure targeting proposals, creating bureaucratic friction within command structures. Real-world humanitarian consequences of systematic infrastructure targeting manifested rapidly throughout Iranian civilian populations. As electrical generation capacity was destroyed, hospitals confronted shortages of power for life-sustaining equipment. Patients dependent on ventilators faced potential death if backup generators failed. Dialysis centers treating kidney disease patients suspended operations due to inadequate electrical power. Refrigeration systems maintaining medical supplies, including vaccines and medications, failed, rendering critical medicines unusable. Water treatment facilities powered by electricity ceased operations, creating contaminated water supplies and generating conditions ideal for epidemic disease transmission. The collapse of urban infrastructure services cascaded into collapsing public health systems precisely at a moment when intense conflict generated urgent medical needs. Injured civilians, requiring hospitalization, faced overwhelmed medical facilities with inadequate supplies, staffing shortages as healthcare workers abandoned dangerous environments, and insufficient power to operate essential equipment. Dr. Amira Hassan, a humanitarian health coordinator who worked in conflict zones across multiple regions, described conditions in Iran. This represents a humanitarian catastrophe developing in real time, when you systematically destroy the infrastructure of modern civilization while conducting an active conflict. You create conditions for mass suffering that extends far beyond combat casualties. Contaminated water kills children through cholera and dysentery. Lack of electricity fails to preserve antibiotics that would have saved lives. These indirect deaths ultimately exceed direct combat casualties. The international response to the bridge strike and broader infrastructure campaign highlighted deep divisions within the global community regarding acceptable military practice. Authoritarian regimes, notably Russia and China, observed American infrastructure targeting with careful interest, calculating how similar tactics could serve their strategic objectives in future conflicts. Traditional American allies in Europe expressed alarm, recognizing that normalization of civilian infrastructure targeting threatened to reduce the protection for their own civilian populations in any potential future military confrontation. Humanitarian organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, issued statements expressing grave concern about warfare methods that appeared to systematically violate international humanitarian law. However, these expressions of concern generated limited practical consequences, as enforcement mechanisms for international humanitarian law remain dramatically weak. The International Criminal Court, despite possessing theoretical jurisdiction over war crimes, has demonstrated limited capacity or willingness to prosecute powerful nations. The Security Council, which possesses authority to refer situations to international criminal prosecution, remains incapacitated by great power vetoes whenever the permanent members face potential legal jeopardy. This structural weakness in international enforcement mechanisms has the consequence that even flagrant violations of established humanitarian law, when committed by powerful states, remain largely immune from meaningful accountability. The specific targeting methodology employed in the April 2nd bridge strike incorporated precision guidance systems, satellite intelligence, and sophisticated military planning that required deliberate decisions at multiple levels. American military officials identified the bridge as a target through intelligence analysis. Planners selected specific munitions, precision-guided 2,000-pound bombs, deemed appropriate for the destruction task. Intelligence analysts briefed decision-makers on the expected consequences of the strike, including civilian casualties. This briefing process represents the juncture where ethical and legal analysis should occur, where officials possess the opportunity to refuse obviously disproportionate operations. Trump administration officials chose to proceed with the operation despite apparent knowledge of expected civilian casualties. The decision to follow the initial strike with a second strike targeting rescue workers involved similarly deliberate choices made by military personnel with awareness that the second strike would generate substantial additional civilian casualties. Each decision point in this sequence represents an opportunity for legal or ethical intervention that did not occur, suggesting that infrastructure targeting and acceptance of substantial civilian casualties had received explicit authorization from political leadership. Military analysts debated whether the bridge strike and related infrastructure targeting represented effective strategy for achieving American political objectives regarding the Strait of Hormuz and Iranian compliance with American demands. Some strategists argued that only through overwhelming civilian pressure and economic disruption could Iran be forced to abandon strategic objectives regarding the waterway. Others contended that infrastructure targeting had historically failed to break civilian resolve, and that continued escalation risked expanding the conflict into domains that neither side could effectively control or terminate. The danger of uncontrolled escalation became apparent as Iran responded to infrastructure strikes by escalating its own attacks on commercial shipping, targeting American allied infrastructure in other nations, and intensifying military operations against American forces throughout the region. The interim ceasefire agreed to in early April appeared to offer opportunity for diplomatic resolution, yet Iranian actions continuing to target shipping and assert control over the strait suggested that infrastructure destruction had not produced the political capitulation that American strategists anticipated. A comprehensive examination of the bridge strike crisis requires addressing practical questions that readers naturally consider when evaluating this extraordinary conflict. Why did American planners target civilian infrastructure rather than focusing exclusively on military objectives? Could American military objectives regarding the strait have been achieved through alternative methods? Potentially, yes, through sustained naval blockade of Iranian ports, accelerated military operations against Iranian naval forces, and expansion of naval escort operations protecting merchant shipping. These approaches would have been more consistent with international humanitarian law and less likely to generate international condemnation. What accountability mechanisms exist for war crimes committed during armed conflict? The International Criminal Court theoretically provides this function, yet enforcement mechanisms remain weak against powerful states. Domestic legal systems could potentially prosecute officials for authorizing illegal operations, though this rarely occurs absent extraordinary political changes. What could the international community do to prevent similar infrastructure targeting in future conflicts? Strengthening enforcement of international humanitarian law through Security Council enforcement mechanisms and increasing practical penalties for violations would incentivize compliance with established legal standards. Industry and military analysts also debate the practical effectiveness of the bridge strike in degrading Iranian military capability and willingness to sustain operations. Iran possesses vast engineering expertise and historical experience reconstructing damaged infrastructure, including successful reconstruction following the devastating Iran-Iraq war that damaged major transportation and industrial facilities. The destruction of the B-1 bridge, while causing immediate transportation disruptions, did not fundamentally impair Iran's capacity to move military supplies through alternative routes, using existing road networks and rail infrastructure. The destroyed bridge did not represent unique military value. Rather, Iranian military forces possessed multiple alternative logistical pathways for sustaining forces throughout their territories. This raised questions about whether the stated military justification for targeting the bridge, claiming it represented a planned military supply route, accurately characterized a civilian transportation structure whose destruction would not measurably affect military operations. The strategic logic appeared to rest not on immediate tactical military necessity, but on longer-term assumptions about civilian pressure and economic disruption. Looking toward the future, the precedent established by the bridge strike and broader infrastructure targeting campaign threatened to fundamentally reshape how future conflicts would be prosecuted globally. If powerful states could systematically target civilian infrastructure with limited international consequences, the protection for civilian populations in future conflicts would diminish substantially. The normalization of infrastructure destruction as acceptable warfare tactic risked creating a vicious cycle wherein each military conflict saw progressively greater civilian infrastructure targeting, with civilian populations bearing exponentially greater suffering. The diplomatic ceasefire agreed to in June 2026, while providing temporary respite from intensive military operations, remained fragile and subject to collapse if either side resumed intensive infrastructure strikes. Iran's continued assertion of control over the Strait of Hormuz and attacks on merchant shipping suggested that infrastructure destruction had not achieved its apparent strategic objective of forcing Iranian capitulation. The Trump administration's threats to resume bombing campaigns targeting additional civilian infrastructure, including power plants, water desalination facilities, and oil wells, created ongoing uncertainty regarding whether the fragile ceasefire would endure. The bridge strike represents a watershed moment in modern warfare, marking the explicit normalization of civilian infrastructure destruction as an acceptable tool of military strategy for powerful states. This development carries profound implications for civilian protection in future conflicts, and for the evolution of international humanitarian law norms that have gradually developed over decades. The double-tap strike methodology employed in targeting rescue workers represents a particularly egregious violation of established humanitarian law principles. Yet the apparent political authorization for such operations suggests that previous legal constraints on military action have been substantially weakened. Whether the international community possesses capacity or willingness to restore meaningful accountability for war crimes and violations of humanitarian law remains deeply uncertain. The weeks and months following the bridge strike will determine whether temporary ceasefire arrangements hold, whether infrastructure destruction resumes, and whether the dangerous precedent established by the April 2026 campaign becomes normalized across global military practice. The destruction of the Karaj B-1 bridge stands as a powerful symbol of how modern conflicts have transformed from primarily military struggles into systematic campaigns against civilian infrastructure and civilian populations. The 8 civilians killed celebrating their nation's new year, the 95 wounded by deliberate targeting of rescue workers, and the billions worldwide affected by disrupted energy supplies and escalating fuel costs represent the true costs of infrastructure-focused warfare. These costs extend far beyond the nations directly engaged in combat, affecting global stability, economic systems, and the foundational humanitarian protections that have attempted to limit civilian suffering, even amid the horrors of armed conflict. The bridge's partial collapse into the ravine below served as a potent visual metaphor for the collapse of international norms and agreements that had previously constrained state violence against civilian populations. Whether these norms can be restored, and whether the international community can establish meaningful accountability for systematic violations of humanitarian law, represents one of the central challenges facing global civilization as it confronts the emerging patterns of 21st century warfare. Make sure you don't miss our continuing coverage of the Iran conflict and its global implications. Subscribe for daily updates as this critical situation develops.